war also had a dramatic, if temporary, impact on traditional racial and gender barriers. The Sleeping Car Porters Union, which is a predominantly African American union, demands that FDR put into defense contracts that defense companies have to hire African American workers. They threaten a massive march and a strike, and FDR agrees. The Fair Employment Practice Commission oversees this and ensures that, in fact, the companies making our tanks and our uniforms and our food for the soldiers and stuff are employing African Americans. This leads to more Great Migration, that is, the blacks leaving the South and heading to the North looking for jobs. It also leads to some violence. In 1943, a Detroit riot kills 34, 25 of whom are black. The Council on Racial Equality, CORE, is founded in 1942 and organizes sit-ins and demonstrations of segregated businesses. We more associate that with the 1960s, but that's actually happening here in the 1940s. Of course, it's a secondary story to the war and doesn't get quite the attention. You'll notice from these pictures as well, it is African-American women who are predominantly working in the factory because, of course, the African-American men are fighting the war. The Army and the Navy take African Americans, but they are still segregated. So if you're black, you're serving in a black unit. You're not serving next to white guys. In fact, if you're in the Navy, you're on a black boat, meaning all the other sailors on the boat are black as well. Blacks are banned from the Air Force and the Marines, with a few exceptions. We do have the Tuskegee Airmen, who this is very controversial. A lot of people believe that blacks were not capable of being pilots. They weren't intelligent enough. Today, of course, I think most of us think that was ridiculous. I certainly do. But it was shocking to a lot of people that these black guys could be such capable pilots, and they certainly were. There were about 700,000 blacks who served in the military, including Dory Miller, who we see up there on the top left, who was at Pearl Harbor. He was a cook, and he ran out and manned a gun and returned fire, one of the few people to do that. The war was significant for Native Americans as well. About 25,000 Native Americans served in the military during the war. Most notably, probably, the code talkers. The only code never to be broken was the Navajo language, the ceremonial Navajo. There was only a few dozen people who spoke this language, and the military figured out that if they got two people who spoke ceremonial Navajo and put them on either sides of a radio, then they had created an unbreakable code. The reason being that the Navajo language is totally unrelated to any other European or Asian language, and so it was impossible to deconstruct because all other codes start in the native language and then are translated into some code and then translated back. But since this had no connection to any language any of our enemies knew, it was unbreakable. For many Native Americans, this was the first time they had been among whites. Remember, Native Americans were still largely on their reservations or in a rural setting and rarely ever around whites. Some would embrace the materialism of white culture as they're exposed to it for the first time. The military economy did not reach the reservations. If you remember, the New Deal had provided significant aid to the Native Americans. But of course, contractors weren't going and hiring Native Americans off the reservation to build the wartime manufacturing. And so the Native Americans were one place in the country where their economic situation declined when the war came about. Native Americans going off to fight for the U.S. also created a labor shortage back home in Native American communities. Cultural relativism, if you remember in the New Deal, there was a sense that we should treat Native American culture with respect. Unfortunately, that declined as the need for conformity that war creates comes about. And there actually became pressure to break up the reservations altogether. It's also worth mentioning that Native American kind of cowboy and Indian movies were very popular, those sorts of stories. And a lot of white guys, this is a white soldier up here on the right, adopted the Native American as kind of a way to be fierce in war. And particularly the airborne soldiers. This guy has shaved his hair into a mohawk and put war paint on. And in this kind of playing Indian when they go to war idea, when they would jump out of the airplanes, they were paratroopers after all, they would shout Geronimo. A Native American of note is Ira Hayes, who's one of the guys who raises the flags. And his really, really sad story, after he raised the flag, the guys who rose that flag became kind of celebrities. and they were brought back home to travel around and try to sell war bonds. And Ira Hayes ended up having a lot of problems with alcohol and depression after the war, and drank himself to death, to a very early death. Kind of a sad story. Wartime demand leads to many Mexicans crossing the border and coming to America looking for work. The U.S. and Mexican governments were both very much in favor of this, and they set up a temporary worker system because the factories in America were desperate for workers. They primarily moved into southwestern cities. But we also see barrios, Mexican neighborhoods, develop in Chicago and Detroit and some northern cities who are desperate for factory workers. This, of course, leads to racial tension. This style that you see here at the time, the style of dress, these guys called themselves pachucos, with the oversized coats and the baggy pants rolled up at the bottom. They wore ducktails, their hair kind of pushed together in the back, and then a little tail coming down at the bottom. And to a lot of Americans who were, this is a time of great conformity in the war. And, of course, in the military, you had the very short hair and the very neatly fitting clothes. And a lot of white Americans were really offended and bothered by this Mexican style of the day. And this really was a problem in places like California, where you had enormous concentrations of both Mexicans and soldiers as they were being shipped over there ready to go out. And in June of 1943, a rumor spreads through Los Angeles, California, that a white girl has been attacked and sexually assaulted by a group of these pachucos. We're pretty sure that's not true. We're pretty sure that it was just a rumor. But nonetheless, a group Marines began spilling out of their bunkers without permission, or their bases without permission, and ran into the streets, soon to be joined by Navy guys from the Navy and the Army as well, and began grabbing any pachucos they could find, ripping their clothes off, setting fire to their clothes, cutting off their ducktails, and just savagely beating these Mexicans. My grandfather, incidentally, I'm sorry to say, was one of these guys. One of the Marines, that is, not one of the pachucos. Now, these outfits the Mexican guys would wear were called zoot suits, and so we call this the zoot suit riot. When the Mexicans would try to fight back, the cops, who of course were white, arrested the Mexicans for fighting back. A sad episode in World War II.